The thermometer read 104.6, and Danny Pruitt's lips had gone the color of old newsprint. That's where this story starts, not with the arrest, not with the gold Cadillac sitting fat and useless in the driveway, but with a young man's body burning itself down to nothing while the television laughed at its own jokes in the next room. I was there, or close enough to there, that the details haven't softened any. It was August of 72, maybe 73, the kind of August that sits on your chest like a wet dog in one move, and the Garrity house on Elmore Road smelled like Ben Gay and boiled coffee, and underneath all of that something sick, or something that had been sick for 3 days and wasn't getting better on its own, no matter how much a certain man in that house wanted to believe otherwise. Danny was 22, Ruth Garrity's younger brother, staying in their spare room since he'd rolled back from Fort Bragg with a medical discharge, and nowhere particular to be a big quiet kid who fixed your carburetor for free and never asked for anything, which maybe explains why nobody thought he'd need much in return. The man of the house was Colt Garrity, 34 years old, thick through the shoulders, thicker through the pride. He drove a 1971 Cadillac Eldorado, the color of a wedding band, gold, loud, obscene, and he wore that car the way other men wore a badge. If I recall correctly, he bought it on credit from a dealership in Amarillo, and hadn't made a full payment since Easter. But that detail has a way of getting lost when a man's driving something that Big Ruth had been awake for 31 hours straight. She put cold cloths on Danny's forehead and made him drink water from a jelly jar, and called Dr. Fenton's office twice. And the second time the woman on the phone said, "Don wait on the doctor, take him to Mercy General, Don wait." Ruth had written that down on the back of an envelope, Don wait. She held that envelope in both hands when she walked into the living room where Colt was reclined in his La-Z-Boy with Lone Star sweating onto the armrest, and the Astros losing in the 5th inning. "He needs the hospital," she said. Colt didn't look away from the set. It's a fever. He sweated out. The nurse said nurses say a lot of things. There's a particular cruelty in that sentence that I've spent years trying to find the right word for. It's not violence exactly. It's something colder, the cruelty of a man who decided that the inconvenience to himself outweighs the emergency in front of him, and who uses the authority of his presence, that big body in that big chair in that house his name was on, to make his decision feel like reason, like medicine, like fact. Colt Garrity wasn't shouting. He didn't have to. He had that voice that men like him develop over years of being agreed with, a voice that assumes the argument is already over. Ruth stood there in the doorway with her envelope. She thought about calling a cab. There was one cab company in Dumas County in 1972, run by a man named Earl Pritchard out of a converted Plymouth Fury, the color of a bruise, and Earl was reliable if you could get him on the line. But the phone in the kitchen had been making a crackling sound for a week, and half the time the line dropped before it connected. She tried anyway 3 times. Silence, static, nothing, the kind of silence that feels personal. So she made a decision that was either brave or desperate or both, which is usually how the best decisions get made. She put on her shoes. She got Danny's arm around her shoulders. He was 6 feet and 170 pounds of dead weight and a furnace besides, and she was 5'3", and she started for the door. That's when Colt stood up. Not to help, let me be plain about that. He stood up the way a dog stands when something crosses its yard. "Where do you think you're going?" he said, not a question, the flat kind. And she said, "I am walking him to the Hendersons and using their phone." And he said some other things after that which I'll leave in the part of the story that doesn't need to be written down. And the short version is that she got out the door with Danny anyway, because Ruth Garrity was the kind of woman the era spent a lot of effort trying to break and mostly failed. They made it 40 yards down Elmore Road, 40 yards of cracked asphalt in the August heat. Danny, barely conscious, 1 foot in front of the other, When the black and white crested the hill, Sheriff Dale Miller drove a '69 Dodge Polara Department issue dents on the rear quarter panel. From a case that nobody talked about anymore, he saw them from 200 yards, a woman supporting a grown man who couldn't hold his own head up, and he didn't slow down to assess. He stopped the car. He was out before the dust settled. The editorial tangent belongs here because I can tell this part without remembering what August in Dumas County smelled like: hot tar and cut alfalfa, and that particular sweetness of a coming thunderstorm that never quite arrives, the kind of smell that gets into your memory and stays there whether you want it to or not. Miller took one look at Danny Pruitt's face and went back to the Polara's radio. He raised dispatch in 40 seconds flat: ambulance priority Elmore Road. Then he turned to Ruth, and he said in that low, deliberate way, he had the voice of a man who'd seen actual emergencies and knew this qualified who's in the house. She told him. Miller nodded. Once he had a way of processing information with his whole body, like the decision was traveling from his head down through his chest and settling somewhere around his belt before he acted on it. He told Ruth to stay with her brother, to keep him talking if she could. He told her the ambulance was 12 minutes out. Then he walked up the driveway toward the gold Eldorado, and the man who hadn't moved from the porch, Colt Garrity, had come out to watch. That was the thing about men like him. They couldn't stay inside when something was happening that involved them. Even when staying inside was their only smart play, he stood on the porch with his Lone Star still in his hand, squinting at the black and white, running the arithmetic on the situation. And you could see from the set of his jaw that the arithmetic kept coming out in his favor. He was a taxpayer. He was on his own property. He hadn't touched anybody. That was his theory of the case, and he was already preparing to deliver it. Miller came up the 3 porch steps without hurrying and without stopping, which meant Colt had to take a half step back without meaning to, which was exactly the point. The sheriff was not a large man in the way that Colt was large. He was lean, son, cured, 61 years old, with 22 years of that county behind his eyes, and before that 2 years of a Pacific War that he folded up and put somewhere you couldn't reach. He had a way of standing that made the available space reorganize itself around him. Evening, Miller said. Sheriff Colt lifted the beer. Like a small salute. Hell of a thing, my wife dragging her brother down the road in this heat. I was just about to go help. Is that right? She didn't give me a chance to. Mr. Garrity, Miller said it quiet, the way you say something when you want to make sure the other person understands that the part of the conversation where they talk is temporarily suspended. I am going to ask you some questions, and I am going to need you to answer them straight. Can you do that? I could be wrong, but I think Colt smiled a little at that point, the smile of a man who believes the rules of a given situation are written in his favor. Your brother-in-law's been running a fever. Yeah, how long? Colt shrugged. Few days. These things run their course. His temperature tonight is 104.6. The duty nurse at Mercy General advised your wife 3 days ago to bring him in. Miller paused and looked at the beer and then back at the man. You have a working vehicle in this driveway. I do, 2 of them. That's right. And you declined to transport him. Something shifted in Colt's face. The smile went somewhere less certain. Now hold on, that's a family matter. I didn't think it was as serious as you didn't think. Miller let that sit for a moment in the thick air. Your wife thought the nurse, thought the thermometer, thought you watched television. Hell, there isn't a poet alive who could improve on that sentence by adding to it. So Miller didn't try. He let it land, and he watched it land. And Colt Garrity stood there with his gold car behind him and his domestic kingdom going sideways in real time. Colt tried one more angle, the way men do when they run out of honest positions. He talked about rights, his rights, the rights of a man in his own home, the overreach of county authority into a private medical decision. He used the word overreach. I remember that specifically because it always strikes me as the last word Of a man who run out of actual arguments a word that sounds like principle but smells like evasion. Miller let him finish. That was another thing about the sheriff. He had the patience of someone who already decided and wasn't in any particular hurry to announce it. When Colt stopped talking, Miller reached into his shirt pocket and produced a folded piece of paper and held it out. Texas Penal Code. He said, Chapter 22, Injury to an adult by omission. A person commits an offense if he has a legal duty to provide care, and he intentionally or knowingly fails to provide it. He refolded the paper. You her husband, her dependent in your household. That duty, that omission, that a third-degree felony in this state. Colt stared at him. Down on Elmore Road, you could hear the ambulance now, that particular Doppler wail rising up through the heat. And Ruth was talking to her brother in a voice too low to make out just the cadence of it, steady and insistent, the sound of a woman keeping someone alive by sheer. Will you not serious? Colt said. When am I not serious, Mr. Garrity? It wasn't rhetorical. Colt actually tried to think of a time and couldn't. The ambulance turned onto Elmore Road, and the red light swept across the Cadillac's gold hood in slow accusatory arcs. Two paramedics out fast, Gurney down, and Ruth stepped back and let them work. And for just a moment she looked up the driveway toward the porch, and her face in that red-washed light was something I don't have adequate words for. Not relief, exactly, not anger, exactly the face of a woman who'd been fighting a private war for 3 days and had just seen reinforcements arrive, and was maybe only now allowing herself to feel how tired she was. Miller put his hand on Colt Garrity's arm and turned him gently toward the door. Let us get your wallet and your keys. He said, you need the car. Colt went inside. He came back out 3 minutes later with his wallet in his hand and a different look on his face, the look of a man whose structure has given way under him and who hasn't yet determined what he's standing on. Miller walked him to the Polara and opened the rear door, and Colt ducked in without being asked, which said something. The door closed with that solid steel click that 1969 Dodge used to manufacture the sound of a thing designed to hold. Miller drove him to the county station at the center of town, past the Dairy Queen and the VFW Hall, and the water tower with Dumas painted on it in letters that were already starting to fade. And I've always thought there was something appropriate in that route, a tour of the ordinary world, that Colt Garrity had decided his comfort mattered more than all of it, going past the windows in the dark like a lesson. Danny Pruitt was admitted to Mercy General at 9:47 that evening with bacterial meningitis. The attending physician told Ruth that another 6 to 8 hours without treatment, and the conversation would have been very different. That's a clinical way to say something brutal, but clinicians have learned to speak in measurements, because measurements don't break down in the middle of a sentence. He recovered. It took 3 weeks and left him with a partial hearing loss in his left ear. And if you asked him about it years later, he'd tap the side of his head and say, well, I always listened better with the right one anyway. That was Danny unassailable. Colt Garrity posted bond 2 days after the arrest and was formally charged in September. His attorney did what attorneys do, which was drag it sideways through the calendar and chip at the edges of the statute. And the eventual disposition was less than what Miller had hoped for: a conviction on a reduced charge, 2 years probation, mandatory counseling, a fine that didn't hurt a man with a Cadillac the way it would hurt a man without one. The system's teeth have always been somewhat selective in that regard. But there's a photograph, and I've seen it, someone's Kodak snapshot that turned up later in the Dumas County Courier of Miller walking Colt Garrity across the parking lot to the station that night, and what strikes you when you look at it is how small the gold Eldorado appears in the background from a distance in the dark. It's just a car, all that chrome and all that statement. And it turns out a Dodge Polara with a man doing his job is worth more on any given August night in any given county in this republic Then any amount of gold finish a dealership in Amarillo can put on a man's ambition. Ruth moved her brother into a ground-floor apartment in Lubbock. The following spring she filed her papers. In October, Miller retired in 1979. He didn't make a speech, he turned in his keys and drove his personal truck, a '67 Chevy Nova with a cracked headliner and 140,000 miles on it, back out Elmore Road one last time just to drive it, and somewhere out past the Garrity place, which had a for sale sign on it. By then, he stopped and looked at the flat horizon, where the sky goes on forever doing nothing in particular. Proverbs says a righteous man cares for the needs of his animals. It doesn't say anything about Cadillacs. The sun was going down, and the dust was up and out to the west. The sky had gone that particular shade of burnt copper that makes you think just briefly that everything is accounted for. It isn't, but some nights it looks that way.